The website did not go dark. It went quiet, no dramatic announcement, no breaking news alert, just a short message posted on an ordinary Friday in June of 2026, sitting on a page that customers had visited for decades to order glue, decals, and sheets of balsa wood. As of June 5th, 2026, Dumas Products is closed. After nearly 80 years, we are officially closing our docks. 80 years since 1946. Since a man named Al Dumas started making model boat kits in Milwaukee, in a country still catching its breath after the war. Think about everything that happened in this country between that year and this one. Television arrived in living rooms. Men walked on the moon. The internet was born. Then it swallowed the world. And through all of it, in a small building that eventually landed in Tucson, Arizona, a company kept doing the same simple thing, selling American sheets of wood and asking them to build a boat with their own hands. By the time the lights went out for good, the company that once shipped tugboats and Chris-Craft racers and PT boats to hobbyists across the world had shrunk down to 3 employees. 3 people closing out what had once been one of the oldest continuously operating hobby manufacturers in America. There was no bankruptcy headline, no factory floor auctioned off on the evening news, just a quiet sign-off, signed simply, the Dumas Crew. But something did sink this company. It didn't happen in a single afternoon, and it didn't happen because of bad luck. It happened slowly over 20 years, while a different kind of boat, one that needed no glue, no sandpaper, no patience at all, quietly took over the water. This is the story of the last American company still asking its customers to build the boat with their own 2 hands, and the story of what finally made that ask too much for a hobby that had moved on. To understand why a company like Dumas mattered, you have to go back to a moment when America was rebuilding itself with its hands. It was 1946. The war was over. Millions of men were coming home, and something had shifted in the country's relationship with time itself. For 4 years, urgency had been the only mode available. Production quotas, rationed materials, machines built fast because there was no other option. Now, for the first time in a long while, there was room to slow down. Room for a hobby. This was also the moment when the American garage was becoming something new. Not just a place to park a car, but a workshop, a retreat. Millions of returning servicemen were settling into new homes, new routines, new versions of peacetime life, and many of them were discovering that their hands, trained for years to move fast under pressure, still wanted something to do in the quiet hours after work. Al Dumas saw that shift and built a small business around it. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he began producing model boat kits, balsa wood cut into hull shapes, decks, and frames, packaged for men and boys to assemble at their own kitchen tables. This was not sophisticated manufacturing. The wood was die-cut, a simple mechanical process that stamped shapes out of thin sheets, leaving the builder to punch out each piece by hand and sand away the rough edges. It was modest. It was also exactly what the moment called for. Boat building, done this way, was slow by design. A hull didn't come together in an afternoon. It came together over weeks. A little glue tonight, a little sanding tomorrow, the hull taking shape the way a real ship might, plank by plank, patience by patience. For a generation of men who had just spent years following orders and meeting deadlines under pressure, there was something quietly radical about a hobby that refused to be rushed. Nobody was shouting orders at you at the kitchen table. Nobody was keeping score. You built the boat exactly as fast or as slow as you wanted to. Dumas didn't invent that desire, but he built a business that fed it, 1 box of balsa sheets at a time. The company changed hands more than once in its early years, moving between owners the way small manufacturing outfits often did in that period. A sale here, a relocation there, nothing that made headlines. It was the kind of instability that could have ended a company before it ever found its footing. Plenty of small hobby manufacturers from that era didn't survive their first decade. Names that once sat on the same hobby shop shelves as Dumas simply disappeared, absorbed or shuttered, forgotten by everyone except the collectors who still hunt down their old kits at swap meets. Instead, sometime in the early 1960s, the business found a family that would define its next 4 decades, the Brandons. Under Brandon ownership, Dumas stopped being just a maker of boat kits and became something closer to a full catalog of American craftsmanship in miniature. New boat designs entered the lineup, and in a move that would come to define the company's identity for the rest of its existence, The Brandon family acquired the tooling and designs to expand into another hobby entirely: balsa wood model airplanes. Two crafts, one philosophy: wood, glue, patience, and the quiet satisfaction of building something that could, if you did it right, actually move. A boat that could float, a plane that could fly. It was a small company with a simple promise, and for the next several decades, that promise would be enough. None of them could have known in those early years that the very thing making their kit special, the hands-on, unhurried nature of the craft, would one day become the reason the company couldn't survive. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Dumas had found its rhythm and its reputation. Walk into any hobby shop in that era, and the name meant something specific. It meant Chris Craft. It meant the gleaming wooden runabouts that had once cruised American lakes in real life, now recreated at a scale small enough to sit on a workbench and eventually skim across a backyard pond. The Dumas Chris Craft 16-foot painted racer became one of the company's signature kits, a boat that asked the builder to sand mahogany-toned decking smooth, to fit hardware with the same care a real boatwright might use, to make something that looked, from 10 feet away, like it belonged in a marina rather than a garage. For a lot of men, that Chris Craft kit wasn't just a model. It was a memory made physical. Real Chris Craft runabouts had been the boat you saw at the lake in the summers of your childhood, the one the family with the cottage owned, the one that pulled water skiers past the public dock while everyone else watched from rowboats and canoes. Building the Dumas version, years later, in a basement or garage, was a way of pulling a piece of that memory back within reach. It meant tugboats, too. Sturdy, unglamorous workhorses like the Lackawanna and the Brooklyn, vessels that had spent their real lives shoving barges around harbors and now spent their model lives teaching a new generation of builders how to plank a hull. There was nothing flashy about a tugboat kit. That was the point. Building one taught patience for its own sake. No speed, no racing stripe, just the slow satisfaction of getting the shape of a working boat exactly right. It meant the Great Lakes Freighter, a kit long enough that finishing it felt like an accomplishment in itself, the kind of project a man might work on through an entire winter, a little each weekend, until spring arrived, and the hull was finally ready for paint. And for builders drawn to history rather than leisure, it meant military vessels, PT boats like the 1978 PT-212 Higgins Patrol torpedo boat, and submarine chasers modeled after real Navy hulls that had once patrolled American coastlines during the war. For veterans and for the sons of veterans, building one of these kits was its own quiet form of remembering. This was the golden stretch of the company's identity, the moment when Dumas and the model boat people were said in the same breath, a nickname the company wore proudly for years. And it wasn't just boats. Under the same roof, the balsa airplane side of the business was building its own following. Kits of the Zero, the Hughes Racer, the AT-6 Texan, classic aircraft rendered in the same patient, stick and tissue construction that had defined model aviation since before the war. A builder could spend a winter on a boat hull and a summer on an airplane frame, and either way, the company had a kit waiting. What made this era last wasn't speed or convenience. It was the opposite. Building a Dumas kit required real skill. Reading plans, cutting balsa cleanly, fitting brass and white metal hardware, understanding how weight and hull shape actually behaved in water. The instructions assumed you wanted to learn, not just to finish. And for the men buying these kits, many of them the same generation who'd grown up during the company's earliest years, that was exactly the appeal. This was a hobby that rewarded patience with something no shortcut could replace. The specific quiet pride of holding a boat you built plank by plank, knowing every seam and every join by hand. You could point to a hatch cover and remember the Tuesday night it took you to get it sitting flush. You could point to a hull and remember exactly which winter you built it. What was happening in your life at the time, who was still around to see it finished. Radio control was part of the picture too, but it was RC in its older form. A builder adding a motor, a receiver, a battery, wiring it all in themselves after weeks of woodworking. The electronics were a final layer on top of a foundation of craftsmanship, not the whole point of the purchase. Getting the boat to actually run was the reward at the end of a much longer story, not the entire transaction. For a long stretch of decades, that formula simply worked. Dumas didn't need to be the biggest name in hobby manufacturing. It only needed to keep making the kind of kit that a patient man could disappear into for a season and come out the other side with something that actually floated, or actually flew. But somewhere out past the horizon, in workshops far from Tucson, a different kind of boat was already taking shape. One that would ask for none of that patience at all. Every industry has a moment when the ground shifts under a company's feet, quietly enough that no one inside notices until it's too late. For Dumas, that shift didn't come from a rival boat company. It came from a change in what building a model was even allowed to mean. The first crack was technical, and it was easy to miss because it looked like progress rather than danger. For most of its history, Dumas had relied on die cutting, a mechanical stamping process that pressed shapes out of sheets of wood, leaving the builder to punch out each part and clean up the edges by hand. It had always been a little imprecise. Parts didn't always separate cleanly. Tolerances varied slightly from sheet to sheet. For decades, that imperfection was simply part of the craft, the kind of minor fiddling a patient builder expected and even took pride in solving. You learned to read the grain. You learned which parts needed a steady hand and a sharp hobby knife to free cleanly from the sheet. But starting in the early 2000s and accelerating over the next 2 decades, the rest of the hobby industry moved to laser cutting. Competing manufacturers began producing wood parts with razor precision, pieces that fit together the first time, with none of the sanding and coaxing that die-cut kits demanded. It was faster to build, more forgiving for beginners, and it quietly reset what customers expected a wood kit to feel like. A new builder picking up a laser-cut competitor's kit for the first time had no memory of die-cutting to compare it to. They only knew that the parts fit, instantly, the way a puzzle piece is supposed to. Dumas kept using its older method. Over time, model boat reviewers began to note it directly, describing die-cut kits as something popular when dinosaurs walked the earth, now replaced by laser cutting across most of the industry. Dumas eventually improved certain details, refining deck fittings and instructions, but the core manufacturing process behind its kits remained rooted in the technology of an earlier decade, even as competitors modernized around it. It wasn't neglect exactly. It was a company that had built its identity around one set of tools, watching the ground beneath those tools slowly erode. That was the first crack. The second was bigger, and it didn't come from inside the woodkit world at all. Through the 2000s and 2010s, an entirely new category of RC boat exploded into the mainstream hobby market, ready to run, or RTR. Brands like Traxxas, ProBoat, and Kyosho began selling boats that arrived almost entirely finished. Brushless motors already installed, electronic speed controllers wired in, hulls molded from plastic and fiberglass rather than built plank by plank from raw wood. A customer could open the box, charge a battery, and be running the boat on open water within the hour. There was no sanding, no fitting hardware by hand, no solder iron, no plans to interpret, no weeks of patient work spread across a kitchen table. Just speed. Literal speed, in fact, since many of these RTR boats were built for racing, capable of blistering velocities that no wooden scale replica was ever designed to achieve. A Chris Craft kit, lovingly built over a winter, might cruise a pond at a stately, scale-accurate pace. A Traxxas Spartan, pulled straight from its box, could cross that same pond fast enough to throw a rooster tail of spray behind it, ready to race again as soon as the battery was swapped. The hobby industry itself began drawing a clear line between the two paths. Wood kit building, retailers explained, was for the craftsman who wants radio control building satisfaction. Projects ranging from simple skiffs to richly detailed masterpieces, built slowly by hand. Fiberglass and plastic RTR boats, meanwhile, were positioned as the answer for those who valued speed and ease more highly. Fewer parts, hulls and decks already joined. Nothing left to build. It wasn't that Dumas' kits got worse. It's that an entire alternative had emerged that removed the very requirement Dumas had built its identity around, the requirement to build anything at all. And the customers who had once formed Dumas' core audience were aging out of the hobby in exactly the years that alternative was taking hold. The men who'd first picked up a Chris Craft kit in the 1960s and 70s were now in their 60s, 70s, 80s. Some kept building, steady hands and old habits dying hard. Many, as health and eyesight and simple time made fine woodworking harder, did not. Reading glasses came out. Steady hands weren't quite so steady. A hobby that had once been an evening's escape started to feel, for some, like a chore they no longer had the patience or the eyesight for. And the generation that might have replaced them, younger hobbyists drawn to radio control, increasingly wanted the Traxxas in the box, not the balsa on the bench. They had grown up in a world of instant gratification, where a new phone worked the moment you turned it on, where entertainment arrived on demand. A hobby that asked for 6 weekends of sanding before you got to see it move was, for most of them, simply asking too much. The company hadn't lost a competition it fought and lost. It had watched the entire category of hobby redefine itself around a different set of values, until patience, the very thing Dumas had spent 80 years asking for, stopped being something most customers were willing to give. By the 2020s, Dumas was still there, still shipping catalogs, still selling tugboats and PT boats and balsa zeros to the builders who remained. But the company operating out of that address on East 17th Street in Tucson had quietly become something smaller than it once was, down eventually to a staff of 3 people keeping alive a hobby that the broader market had mostly moved past. The end, when it came, would not be sudden. It would look instead like a company simply running out of tomorrow. There was no single dramatic collapse. That's not how a company this size disappears. Instead, there was a spring morning in 2026 when a notice went up, likely first seen by longtime customers checking the website for a part number, or a hobby retailer placing a routine order. The notice was plain and businesslike. Dumas Products, it said, would be closing its doors. Orders would be processed for a few more weeks. Then, that would be it. For a company built on patience, even its ending asked for a little more of it. The date shifted once the initial announcement went out. The kind of small human adjustment that happens when 3 people are trying to wind down 80 years of inventory, tooling, and unfinished orders with almost no staff left to do it. What was first expected to close in mid-May stretched into early June. Whether that extra time came from a final rush of orders, a backlog of shipments, or simply the practical difficulty of shutting down a business with so few hands left to do the work, the record doesn't say. What it does show is this: the company that had never rushed a customer through a kit build did not rush its own ending either. Picture what those final weeks actually looked like, because no press release will describe it for you. 3 people in a building on East 17th Street in Tucson working through what remained. Shelves that had once held rows of tugboat kits and PT boat plans, growing sparser by the week, as remaining stock got packed into boxes and shipped out to the last customers who wanted them. A warehouse quieter than it had been in decades. No rush of new inventory coming in, only orders going out. One final wave of Chris Craft racers and balsa zeros finding their way to workbenches that would, in some cases, be the last builds those particular kits ever saw. Somewhere in that final wave was likely a man not so different from the ones who'd been buying Dumas kits since the 1970s, placing one more order, maybe without even realizing it would be his last chance to. A man who'd built 3 or 4 of these kits over the decades, who still had a half-finished tugboat sitting in his garage from a project he kept meaning to get back to. He wouldn't have known, opening that final envelope from Tucson, that the return address was about to disappear for good. There would have been phone calls too, the same 520 area code that had answered customer questions for decades, now fielding a different kind of conversation. Customers asking if a part was still in stock. Longtime hobbyists, the kind who'd been ordering from Dumas since the 1980s or 90s, calling one more time simply to ask if the rumors were true. On the other end of those calls, in an office growing emptier by the week, were 3 people trying to answer honestly, without quite knowing how to say goodbye to strangers, who felt, after so many years of doing business together, like something closer to old friends. And somewhere in that final stretch, someone at the company sat down to write the message that would eventually replace the product catalog on the website altogether. It wasn't corporate. It wasn't defensive. It read like a letter from people who understood exactly what they were closing. To our loyal hobbyists, collectors, and builders, it began, the time has come for us to drop anchor and close this chapter. It thanked customers, not investors, not shareholders, but the people who had actually built the boats, for sharing your photos and your dedication to the craft. It made a point of saying something that mattered to anyone who has ever finished a model with their own hands. You didn't just buy our kits, you brought them to life. Read that line again, slowly, and you understand exactly what Dumas believed it had been selling all along. Not plastic, not wood, not even boats, really. A chance for an ordinary person to bring something to life with nothing but glue, patience, and their own two hands. Then came the sign-off that would end up as the company's final public words, posted for anyone who visited the site afterward to read, "We wish each of you fair winds and following seas on all your future voyages." Signed simply, the Dumas crew. There was no mention of a buyer stepping in to save the brand. No announcement of a merger, no private equity firm absorbing the name the way so many other hobby manufacturers had been absorbed and hollowed out over the decades before them. There was, as far as the public record shows, simply a company that had grown too small, serving a hobby that had grown too niche, run by people who chose to close it honestly rather than let it fade into confusion or unpaid orders. And somewhere in that closure, a quieter loss took place. One the announcement didn't dwell on, because there was likely no one left whose job it was to preserve it. The die-cutting tools that had shaped Dumas hulls since the earliest Brandon years, the master plans for the Great Lakes freighter, the Carroll Moran tug, the SC-1 subchaser. Decades of drawings and dies that had turned raw balsa and basswood into three-dimensional history, going dark along with everything else. No industry reporting has confirmed what became of that tooling, whether it was archived, sold in pieces, or simply left behind in a closing warehouse. That silence is its own kind of ending. By June 5th, 2026, it was over. Not with the noise of a factory floor going still, the way the old industrial giants used to end, no locked gates, no final whistle, no crowd of workers walking to a parking lot for the last time. Just a small manufacturing office in the Arizona heat, and 3 people locking a door that would not open again. The model boat people had, after 80 years, finally stopped building. So, what actually gets lost when a company like Dumas closes? Not much, if you're measuring by the numbers that usually define an industrial collapse. No factory town lost its largest employer, no thousands of workers walked out with severance checks, and no plan for Monday morning. 3 people closed an office in Tucson, and most of the country never heard about it at all. But measure it a different way, and the loss gets larger. Somewhere in this country right now, in a garage or a basement workshop, there's a Chris Craft 16-foot racer sitting on a shelf, mahogany-toned decking sanded smooth by hand, hardware fitted piece by piece over a winter, maybe 2 winters, by someone who is now considerably older than he was when he started it. There's a tugboat, a Lackawanna or a Brooklyn, that some builder spent a season planking, plank by plank, the way the box always asked him to. There's a Balsa Zero or a Hughes racer hanging from monofilament line in someone's den, wings covered in tissue paper that same builder stretched and doped himself decades ago, following instructions written by people who assumed he wanted to learn the craft, not just own the result. Those boats still float. Those planes, some of them, could probably still fly. The company that made the kits is gone, but the specific quiet pride of having built something with your own hands, that doesn't get repossessed. Nobody can close that down. Maybe that's you reading this. Maybe there's a Dumas kit somewhere in your own house right now, up in the attic, out in the garage, on a shelf in a den nobody uses much anymore. Maybe you built it with your father, or your son built it with you. One winter that's harder to place exactly than it used to be. If it's still there, it's worth going and looking at it again, not to sell it, just to remember what it took to make it. What's harder to replace is the door Dumas kept open for 80 years. The door that let a beginner start with raw balsa, a set of plans, and a tube of glue, and come out the other side understanding exactly how a hull holds its shape in water, or how a wing frame carries weight in the air. The RTR boats that now dominate the market are faster, easier, and in their own way genuinely impressive pieces of engineering. But they don't teach you anything except how to charge a battery. They arrive as objects. Dumas kits arrived as invitations, and it took a particular kind of patience, increasingly rare, to accept one. That patience isn't entirely gone. It's just harder to find a company still willing to sell to it. Somewhere out there, a handful of the last wood kit manufacturers, smaller, quieter operations most people have never heard of, are still cutting balsa sheets for the builders who haven't given it up yet. But the field keeps narrowing. Every company like Dumas that closes makes the remaining ones look a little more like relics and a little more likely to be next. For the men who bought their first Dumas kit in 1968 or 1975 or 1990, the ones this channel is really for, the closure probably didn't arrive as tragedy. It arrived the way most quiet endings do, as a small, sad piece of news, read once, maybe mentioned to a friend from the old hobby shop days, then folded back into a Tuesday that otherwise went on as normal. No parade, no obituary in the local paper. Just one more small American company, quietly done. But if you go looking, the evidence of what Dumas built is still out there. In closets, on shelves, in photographs pinned to hobby forums, of hulls finished 30 years ago and never thrown away. The company is gone. The boats, somehow, are not. Somewhere in Tucson, the building at 909 East 17th Street still stands. The phone number's still technically connected, though no one answers it anymore. And somewhere in 100,000 American homes, a small wooden boat sits on a shelf, gathering a little dust, waiting for someone to remember it was built to actually go in the water, and to decide, one more time, whether it still can.